Nothing but kitchen help, Sophia Castellano spat, her diamond-encrusted fingers dismissing Isabella with a wave that could have bought a small car. My future daughter-in-law shouldn't even know your name. The words cut through the marble-lined kitchen of the Castellano mansion like a blade through silk, each syllable dripping with the kind of cruelty only old money could perfect. Isabella Rodriguez kept her eyes down, her calloused hands steady as she continued chopping vegetables for the evening's feast. 26 years old and more beautiful than any of the socialites who frequented these halls, she possessed the kind of natural grace that couldn't be bought with all the Castellano fortune. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, revealing the elegant curve of her neck that had caught more than one admiring glance from the family's associates. She had been working as the head cook for the Castellano family for 3 years, ever since her father's construction company had fallen into debt to their organization. The kitchen bustled around them with the controlled chaos of dinner preparation for 50 guests. Tonight was special. The formal announcement of an arranged marriage between Don Lorenzo Castellano's only daughter, Maria, and the son of a rival family from Chicago. It was the kind of strategic alliance that had kept the Castellano Empire strong for 4 generations, binding territories and blood in equal measure. Isabella had spent weeks planning the menu, incorporating traditional Italian dishes alongside American favorites, creating a feast worthy of cementing a peace treaty disguised as a wedding celebration. Isabella makes the best ossobuco this side of Sicily, came a small voice from the doorway. 8-year-old Sofia, Don Lorenzo's youngest daughter, slipped into the kitchen with the stealth of someone who had learned to navigate adult conversations carefully. Her dark eyes, so like her father's, sparkled with defiance as she faced down her aunt. Papa says she's the only cook who makes it better than Nonna used to. Sophia Castellano's face flushed red beneath her expertly applied makeup. Sophia, children shouldn't be in the kitchen during preparations. Your father has guests arriving soon. Her tone carried the authority of someone who had spent decades wielding power through her brother's influence, but the little girl didn't flinch. Sophia moved directly to Isabella's side, her small hand reaching up to touch the cook's arm. There was something profound in that simple gesture, a connection that transcended the rigid social hierarchies that governed their world. Isabella's heart clenched at the child's loyalty. Sophia had lost her mother 2 years ago in a car accident, and in the absence of maternal warmth, she had begun seeking comfort from the one woman in the house who showed her genuine kindness. The kitchen staff exchanged glances, understanding the delicate position they all occupied. In the Castellano household, lines were drawn in invisible ink but enforced with visible consequences. Isabella was undocumented, brought into the country by her desperate father who had gambled everything on the American dream. Her position here was both sanctuary and prison, protected by Don Lorenzo's respect for her culinary skills, but trapped by circumstances that made escape impossible. The guests will expect perfection tonight, Sophia continued, her voice taking on the edge that indicated she was preparing to deliver another cutting remark. I trust even someone of your background can understand the importance of this evening. The pause before background carried the weight of every prejudice that had ever been wielded like a weapon in these halls. Isabella finally looked up, her brown eyes meeting Sophia's gaze with quiet dignity. The dinner will be perfect, Mrs. Castellano. I've been preparing since dawn. Her English carried only the faintest trace of her Mexican accent, polished through years of determination to prove herself worthy of respect in a world that seemed determined to deny it to her. The sound of car doors slamming in the circular driveway announced the arrival of the evening's guests. Through the kitchen's high windows, Isabella could see black sedans and luxury SUVs arranged with military precision. Men in dark suits emerged, their movements coordinated with a kind of awareness that spoke of constant vigilance. This was Don Lorenzo's world, a realm where every handshake was a negotiation, and every smile carried the potential for either alliance or betrayal. Don Lorenzo Castellano himself appeared in the kitchen doorway, his presence immediately commanding attention from every person in the room. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to emphasize shoulders that had once been broad enough to intimidate rivals through presence alone. But it was his eyes that truly defined him. Intelligent, calculating, yet capable of surprising warmth when directed toward his daughters. "Isabella," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could silence a room or start a war. "I wanted to personally thank you for tonight's preparations. My associates from Chicago have very particular tastes." His gaze moved to his sister with barely concealed irritation. "Sophia, our guests are waiting in the library. Perhaps you could ensure they're properly welcomed." The dismissal was polite, but absolute. Sophia's jaw tightened, but she knew better than to challenge her brother's authority in front of the staff. She swept from the kitchen with wounded dignity, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and suppressed resentment. Sophia remained pressed against Isabella's side, her small presence a bridge between two worlds that were never meant to touch. Don Lorenzo's expression softened as he looked at his daughter, the transformation from commanding patriarch to loving father happening in the space of a heartbeat. "Sophia, you should be getting ready for dinner. Maria will need your support tonight." As father and daughter left the kitchen together, Isabella returned to her preparations with hands that trembled only slightly. She couldn't have known that upstairs, Maria Castellano was staring at her reflection in the mirror of her childhood bedroom, tears threatening to ruin makeup that had taken an hour to apply. The arranged marriage felt like a beautiful cage, and Maria found herself envying the freedom she imagined the cook possessed, the ability to choose her own path, even if that path led through the servants' quarters of someone else's mansion. The dinner had been a masterpiece of diplomatic cuisine, each course carefully orchestrated to honor both Italian tradition and American sensibilities. Isabella watched from the kitchen doorway as Don Lorenzo raised his glass in a toast to his daughter's engagement, his voice carrying across the dining room with practiced warmth that masked the strategic calculations beneath. She couldn't help but notice how Maria's smile never quite reached her eyes, how her fingers gripped her wine glass as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to her chair. 3 hours later, after the last guest had departed and the dishes had been cleared, Isabella found herself alone in the kitchen, methodically cleaning the final pans. The house had settled into the kind of silence that only came after great performances, when all the actors had finally dropped their masks. She didn't hear the soft footsteps until a voice broke the stillness. The ossobuco was incredible. Don Lorenzo stood in the doorway, having shed his formal jacket and loosened his tie. Without the armor of complete formal dress, he looked younger, more approachable. "My guests were particularly impressed. Antonio Marcelli asked if I might consider lending you to his daughter's wedding next month." Isabella paused in her cleaning, uncertain how to respond to what might have been a compliment or a reminder of her status as a commodity to be borrowed. "I'm glad the dinner met your expectations, Mr. Castellano." She kept her voice carefully neutral, the way she had learned to navigate conversations with men who held absolute power over her circumstances. "Lorenzo," he corrected, moving further into the kitchen with an ease that suggested this wasn't his first late-night visit to the domain she ruled. "When it's just us, please. The formality feels unnecessary after everything you've done for my family." He gestured toward the spotless counters, the evidence of hours of preparation and cleanup that had made the evening's success possible. The request for informality felt dangerous in ways Isabella couldn't quite articulate. In her world, respect was armor, and the careful maintenance of proper distance had kept her safe in situations where familiarity could be mistaken for availability. But there was something in Lorenzo's tone that suggested genuine respect rather than the casual dismissal she had grown accustomed to from his associates. "Your daughter seemed quiet tonight," Isabella observed, immediately regretting the words. It wasn't her place to comment on family dynamics, especially not the arranged marriage that had just been formally announced to two powerful crime families. Lorenzo's expression darkened, but not with anger at her presumption. Instead, she saw the conflict of a father who loved his daughter, but was trapped by traditions older and more powerful than personal desires. Maria understands her responsibilities to the family. The Marcelli alliance will secure our position for the next generation. The words sounded rehearsed, like something he had repeated to himself until he almost believed it. Isabella recognized the tone. She had used it herself when explaining to her own family why she couldn't return to Mexico, why her father's debts had bound her to this house and this life. Sometimes survival required convincing yourself that necessity was choice. In Mexico, my grandmother used to say that food cooked with resentment always tastes bitter, Isabella said carefully, testing the boundaries of their conversation. Even when all the ingredients are perfect. Lorenzo looked at her sharply, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of patriarchal responsibility showing in the slump of his posture. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. I imagine she taught you more than just cooking. She taught me that love and duty don't always point in the same direction, Isabella replied, her honesty surprising herself. But she also taught me that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that let other people be happy. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people from completely different worlds finding unexpected common ground in the complexity of family obligation. Isabella finished cleaning the last pan, her movements economical and graceful. Lorenzo watched her work with the kind of attention he usually reserved for business negotiations, noting the precision of her motions, the way she transformed chaos into order with effortless skill. Sophia asks about you constantly, he said finally. She wants to know if you have children of your own, if you miss your family. I realize I've never asked you these questions myself. The admission hung between them, an acknowledgement that despite 3 years of sharing the same house, they had remained strangers by design. Isabella dried her hands on a kitchen towel, buying time to consider her response. Personal information was currency in this world, and she had learned to spend it carefully. I have a younger brother in Guadalajara, she said finally. He's studying engineering at the university. My salary here pays his tuition. The words came out matter-of-factly, but they carried the weight of sacrifice that had shaped every decision she had made since crossing the border. Lorenzo nodded slowly, understanding more than she had actually said. In his world, family loyalty was both weakness and strength, the foundation that could either elevate or destroy everything you tried to build. And your parents? My father works construction when there's work available. My mother cleans houses. Isabella's voice remained steady, but Lorenzo caught the slight tightening around her eyes. They're proud of what I've accomplished here, even if they don't fully understand what my life is like. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet on marble stairs. Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair tousled from sleep, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. She looked uncertainly between her father and Isabella, sensing she had stumbled into something more complex than a simple late-night conversation. Papa, I heard voices. Is everything okay? Her voice carried the kind of hypervigilance that children develop when they've learned that adult conversations often determine their fate. Lorenzo's demeanor shifted instantly, his voice becoming gentle in the way that was reserved exclusively for his daughters. Everything's fine, Principessa. Isabella was just finishing in the kitchen. Shouldn't you be asleep? Sophia moved directly to Isabella's side, the gesture so natural it was clearly a well-established pattern. I wanted to tell Isabella that Mrs. Marcelli said her cannoli were better than the ones in Little Italy. I thought she should know. Isabella knelt down to Sophia's eye level, her face softening with genuine affection. That's very kind of you to tell me, mi niña. Did you enjoy the party? It was okay, Sophia said with the diplomatic skills of someone raised in a household where honesty could be dangerous. Maria looked very pretty in her dress, but she seemed sad. The child's observation was delivered with the brutal accuracy that only children possessed. Lorenzo and Isabella exchanged a glance over Sofia's head, both recognizing the truth that an 8-year-old had articulated more clearly than any of the adults present. In that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition that they were both trying to protect the same things, even if they approached that protection from completely different angles. "Come on, sweetheart," Lorenzo said, lifting Sofia into his arms with practiced ease. "Let's get you back to bed. Isabella needs to finish her work." As father and daughter left the kitchen, Lorenzo paused in the doorway. "Isabella, thank you for everything you do for my family. I know it's not easy." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of acknowledgement that she had never received from anyone in his position. After they were gone, Isabella stood alone in her perfectly ordered kitchen, feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in the careful balance she had maintained for 3 years. She couldn't have known that upstairs, Lorenzo was tucking Sofia into bed while wrestling with questions he had never allowed himself to ask about the woman who had become such an integral part of his daughter's lives. The wedding preparations began the following week, with the efficiency of a military campaign. The Castellano mansion transformed into a staging ground for an event that would be remembered in both New York and Chicago circles for years to come. Isabella found herself at the center of the storm, coordinating catering for 300 guests while navigating the increasingly complex emotions that swirled through the household like smoke. Maria had taken to spending hours in the kitchen, ostensibly discussing menu details, but actually seeking refuge from the constant stream of dress fittings, flower arrangements, and diplomatic meetings that filled her days. She and Isabella had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared status as women whose lives were shaped by circumstances beyond their control. "I've never even kissed anyone," Maria confessed one Tuesday afternoon while Isabella prepared pastry dough for the engagement party's dessert course. The words tumbled out with the kind of desperate honesty that comes from having no one else to tell. "And in 6 weeks, I'm supposed to marry a man I've met exactly 3 times. Isabella's hands never paused in their work, but her expression softened with empathy. At 24, Maria possessed her father's intelligence and her mother's beauty, but she had been sheltered in ways that Isabella's harder life had never allowed. "What do you know about him? About Antonio Jr.? He's handsome enough?" Maria said with a shrug that attempted casualness. "Educated. His father speaks well of his business sense. He was polite during our chaperoned dinners." The list sounded like a resume rather than a description of a future husband. "But when he looks at me, I feel like he's calculating my worth rather than seeing me as a person. Like I'm a beautiful asset being transferred from one portfolio to another." Maria's fingers twisted in her lap, her usual composure cracking to reveal the frightened young woman beneath. Isabella understood that feeling all too well. She had seen it in the eyes of men who viewed her as disposable help, interchangeable with any other woman desperate enough to work for whatever wages they offered. "Sometimes people surprise you," she offered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. The kitchen door swung open, interrupting their conversation. Don Lorenzo entered with a kind of focused energy that indicated business concerns, but he stopped short when he saw his daughter's distressed expression. The transformation from crime boss to protective father happened instantaneously, his entire demeanor shifting to accommodate the needs of someone he loved more than his own life. "Maria, what's wrong?" His voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to solving problems through sheer force of will. "Nothing, Papa," Maria replied quickly, the automatic response of someone who had learned not to burden others with her fears. "Isabella and I were just discussing the dessert menu." Lorenzo's gaze moved between his daughter and his cook, his intuition sharpened by decades of reading people's true intentions. He saw the evidence of tears in Maria's eyes, the protective way Isabella had positioned herself slightly closer to his daughter. Something was happening here that went beyond menu planning. The Marcellis have requested a meeting tomorrow, Lorenzo said carefully, watching his daughter's reaction. They want to discuss the final details of the ceremony. Your presence will be required. Maria's face went pale, but she nodded with the obedience that had been trained into her since childhood. Of course, Papa. Whatever you think is best. The words hit Lorenzo like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. He recognized the tone. It was the same one his own father had used when discussing business arrangements, the voice of someone who had learned to suppress personal desires in service of family obligation. The realization that he was perpetuating the same cycle filled him with an unexpected wave of self-doubt. Maria, I want you to understand something, Lorenzo said, moving closer to his daughter. This marriage is about securing our family's future. But if Antonio proves to be unsuitable, arrangements can be made. Your happiness matters to me more than any business alliance. The offer was unprecedented in their world, where women's marriages were strategic tools rather than personal choices. Isabella felt her breath catch, understanding the magnitude of what Lorenzo had just promised. In their society, backing out of an arranged marriage could mean war, could destroy everything the Castellano family had built over 4 generations. I mean it, Lorenzo confirmed, his tone carrying the weight of absolute commitment. But I need you to give this a real chance. Get to know Antonio. See if there's something real that could grow between you. Can you do that for me? Maria nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. The conversation might have ended there, with father and daughter finding common ground in compromise. But Sofia chose that moment to burst into the kitchen with the theatrical energy of someone who had important news to share. Papa! Aunt Sofia says Isabella has to find somewhere else to work after the wedding because it wouldn't be appropriate for Antonio Jr.'s wife to have gotten so close to the help. The words tumbled out in an indignant rush, Sofia's 8-year-old sense of justice clearly offended by what she had overheard. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella felt her world tilt on its axis. All her carefully constructed security suddenly revealed as an illusion. 3 years of building a place for herself in this household, of becoming indispensable to this family, and it could all be erased by the preferences of a man she had never met. Lorenzo's expression darkened with a fury that Isabella had only seen him direct at business rivals. Sofia said what? His voice was dangerously quiet, the tone that his enemies had learned to fear. She was talking to Mrs. Marcelli on the phone, Sofia continued, oblivious to the storm she had unleashed. She said that Antonio Jr. thinks it's inappropriate for married women to have relationships with domestic staff, and that Isabella would have to go work for some other family, or maybe go back to Mexico. Isabella's hands gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white with the effort of remaining upright. Going back to Mexico meant poverty, meant watching her brother drop out of university, meant abandoning the life she had fought so hard to build. But more than that, it meant leaving Sofia, leaving Maria during the most difficult transition of her life, leaving the only place that had ever felt like home. Isabella isn't going anywhere, Lorenzo said, his words carrying the absolute authority of a man who had never been contradicted. This is her home. Sofia needs her. Maria needs her. And He paused, as if surprised by what he had almost said. I need her here too. The admission hung in the air like a confession, revealing truths that none of them had been prepared to acknowledge. Isabella looked up to find Lorenzo's eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made her heart race in ways that were both terrifying and thrilling. Maria was watching the exchange between her father and their cook with growing understanding, her own romantic troubles suddenly seeming less significant in the face of the complex emotions swirling around her. She had seen the way her father's expression softened when he spoke to Isabella, had noticed how he found excuses to visit the kitchen more frequently than household management required. The question hung between them like a loaded gun, forcing all 3 adults to confront truths they had been carefully avoiding. In the Castellano world, such feelings were not just inappropriate, they were potentially explosive. capable of destroying alliances, triggering conflicts, and upending everything Lorenzo had built. Lorenzo looked at his daughter, then at Isabella, his face reflecting the internal struggle between duty and desire that had been building for weeks. Maria. Some questions are more dangerous than the answers they might reveal. But as he spoke, his eyes never left Isabella's face, and in that moment, everyone in the kitchen understood that the upcoming marriage was not the only relationship that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of tradition. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of barely controlled chaos as wedding preparations intensified, and the tension between duty and desire reached a breaking point. Isabella threw herself into her work with desperate focus, creating elaborate menus and coordinating with vendors as if perfect execution could somehow resolve the impossible situation that had developed around her. The Marcelli family arrived for an extended stay, taking over the mansion's guest wing with the confident energy of people accustomed to having their preferences accommodated without question. Antonio Jr. proved to be exactly what Maria had feared: handsome, educated, and utterly indifferent to anything about her beyond her value as a strategic asset. He treated the staff with casual dismissal, referring to Isabella as the Mexican when he bothered to acknowledge her presence at all. The help seems unusually familiar with the family, Antonio Jr. observed to his father during one of their private conversations, unaware that Isabella was arranging flowers in the adjoining room. In Chicago, we maintain clearer boundaries between business and domestic arrangements. The comment reached Lorenzo's ears through the household's informal intelligence network, and his response was swift and unmistakable. That evening, he made a point of publicly thanking Isabella for her contributions to the family, praising her skills in front of the Marcelli delegation, with the kind of detailed attention that left no doubt about her value to the household. But the damage was already spreading. Sophia Castellano, sensing opportunity in the tension, began making increasingly pointed comments about maintaining appropriate standards and preserving family reputation. Her campaign was subtle but relentless, designed to create doubt about Isabella's position without directly challenging her brother's authority. Lorenzo, Sophia said during a family meeting ostensibly focused on wedding logistics, I think we need to discuss the long-term staffing arrangements. After Maria marries, the household dynamics will change significantly. Antonio Jr. has mentioned his concerns about maintaining proper protocol. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, but he was trapped by the political realities of the situation. Openly defying his future son-in-law's preferences could jeopardize the alliance that had taken months to negotiate. Isabella has served this family excellently for 3 years. I see no reason to alter arrangements that have proven successful. Of course, Sophia agreed smoothly. But perhaps we could consider a transition plan. Something that addresses the Marcelli family's concerns while respecting Isabella's contributions. Maybe a position with one of our other associates, or assistance in establishing her own catering business. The suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but Isabella recognized them for what they were: elegant methods of removal that would solve the problem she represented without creating obvious conflict. She had become an obstacle to the smooth functioning of a marriage alliance, and obstacles in the Castellano world were removed efficiently and permanently. Maria, meanwhile, was struggling with her own revelation. Watching her father's carefully controlled interactions with Isabella had opened her eyes to the possibility that duty and desire didn't have to be mutually exclusive. She began observing their interactions with new awareness, seeing the subtle signs of attraction that had been developing beneath the surface of professional courtesy. Isabella, Maria said one afternoon while they worked together preparing hors d'oeuvres for yet another pre-wedding gathering. Can I ask you something personal? Isabella nodded, though her hands never paused in their precise movements. She had learned to work through conversations, using the rhythm of familiar tasks to maintain emotional equilibrium during difficult discussions. Do you have feelings for my father? The question was asked with Maria's characteristic directness, cutting through the careful politeness that usually governed their interactions. Isabella's hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. "Maria, that's not an appropriate question for me to answer. That's not a no," Maria observed with a small smile that reminded Isabella powerfully of Lorenzo's expression when he was pleased with himself. "And it's not inappropriate if I'm asking because I want you to be happy. Both of you." The conversation was interrupted by Sofia's arrival in the kitchen, her small face serious with the weight of important information. "Isabella, I heard Papa and Mr. Antonio arguing in the study. Mr. Antonio said you make him uncomfortable and that you shouldn't be working here after the wedding." Isabella felt her heart sink, even as Maria's expression hardened with indignation. The child's innocent report confirmed what they had all suspected. The pressure to remove Isabella was intensifying, and soon Lorenzo would be forced to choose between his personal desires and his family's political necessities. He said Mr. Antonio should focus on being a good husband instead of managing the household staff, Sophia reported with satisfaction. Then Mr. Antonio got really angry and said some words I'm not supposed to repeat. The confrontation had clearly escalated beyond polite disagreement, moving into the dangerous territory where personal slights became matters of honor. In the Castellano world, such conflicts could quickly spiral into something much larger than a simple disagreement about domestic arrangements. That evening, Isabella made a decision that had been building for days. She waited until the house had settled into nighttime quiet, then made her way to Lorenzo's study, where she knew he would be reviewing business papers and attempting to find solutions to problems that seemed to have no good answers. She knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, her heart racing with the knowledge that whatever happened next would change everything between them. "Come in," Lorenzo's voice called, and she entered to find him sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, his usually perfect appearance disheveled with stress and exhaustion. "Isabella?" He looked surprised to see her, rising from his chair with the automatic courtesy that was so deeply ingrained it functioned even during private moments. "Is everything all right? Is Sofia having nightmares again?" "Lorenzo," she said, using his first name with deliberate intent. "We need to talk about what's happening. About the Marcellis. About my position here. About—" She paused, gathering courage for words that could destroy the careful balance they had maintained. "About us." Lorenzo moved around the desk, closing the distance between them until they were standing close enough that she could see the conflict in his dark eyes. "Isabella, there is no us. There can't be. You know that as well as I do." "But there is," she said softly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had finally decided to speak the truth, regardless of consequences. "There has been for weeks now. Every conversation, every look, every excuse you find to come to the kitchen. You feel it too." Lorenzo's control finally cracked, his carefully maintained facade crumbling under the weight of suppressed emotion. "Of course I feel it," he admitted, his voice rough with frustration and desire. "Do you think this has been easy for me, watching you every day, knowing I can't touch you, can't tell you how I feel, can't even imagine a future where we could be together?" The admission hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Isabella took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the rapid pulse at his throat that betrayed his emotional state. "Then don't let them send me away," she whispered, her hand reaching up to touch his face with the gentle reverence of someone touching something precious and fragile. "Fight for this. Fight for me." Lorenzo closed his eyes at her touch, his composure finally breaking completely. When he opened them again, Isabella saw a decision forming in their depths, a resolve that would challenge everything his world expected from a man in his position. "I will," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise that would reshape both of their lives. "Whatever it costs, I will." The confrontation that would determine all their futures came exactly 1 week before Maria's wedding. triggered by an incident that exposed the growing tensions in the household like a match thrown into gasoline. Antonio Jr., emboldened by what he perceived as his increasing influence over family decisions, made the mistake of attempting to discipline Sofia for spending time in the kitchen with Isabella. A Castellano child shouldn't be socializing with domestic staff, he told the 8-year-old with the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned his right to remake the world according to his preferences. Your father should have taught you better boundaries by now. Sofia, possessing her father's strength of will compressed into a child's fearless honesty, looked up at her future brother-in-law with undisguised contempt. Isabella is my friend, and you're not my papa. You can't tell me what to do. The exchange escalated quickly, with Antonio Jr. attempting to assert authority he didn't possess, and Sofia responding with increasingly vocal defiance. The commotion drew Isabella from the kitchen, arriving just as Antonio Jr. raised his hand in frustration, clearly intending to strike the child who dared challenge his commands. Isabella moved without thinking, placing herself between Sofia and the man who represented everything she had learned to fear about unchecked power. "Don't touch her," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "She's a child." "And you're nobody," Antonio Jr. snarled, his facade of polished sophistication dropping to reveal the entitled brutality beneath. "You're hired help with no right to interfere in family discipline. In fact, you're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house." "This isn't your house," came Lorenzo's voice from the hallway, each word dropping into the silence like stones into still water. His presence filled the space with the kind of dangerous energy that preceded violence, his eyes fixed on Antonio Jr. with predatory intensity. "And if you ever threaten my daughter, or any member of my household again, you'll discover exactly how unforgiving I can be." Antonio Jr. turned to face Lorenzo, his confidence wavering but his arrogance intact. "Lorenzo, we need to discuss appropriate boundaries. This woman has clearly forgotten her place, and your daughter needs to learn respect for authority. These are important lessons for a child who will be joining our family." "Sofia will never be joining your family," Lorenzo said, his tone carrying the finality of an executioner's blade. "The engagement is over. The wedding is cancelled. You can explain to your father why you've just destroyed an alliance that took 6 months to negotiate." The words hit the air like an explosion, their implications rippling outward to touch every aspect of both families' carefully constructed plans. Maria, who had been approaching from the opposite hallway, stopped in shock, her hand covering her mouth as she processed what she had just heard. "You can't be serious," Antonio Jr. stammered, his bravado evaporating as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. "Over some domestic dispute? Your daughter is contractually obligated to marry me. The families have already made agreements." "My daughter," Lorenzo said, moving closer to the younger man with the fluid grace of a predator closing in on prey, "is not property to be transferred according to contracts. She's a human being who deserves better than a man who would strike a child to assert his authority." The implications of Lorenzo's decision crashed over Isabella like a tidal wave. He was destroying a crucial business alliance, potentially triggering a conflict between two powerful families, risking everything he had built over decades of careful political maneuvering. And he was doing it for her, for Sofia, for the principle that some things mattered more than strategic necessity. "Papa," Maria said softly, her voice carrying wonder and something that might have been relief. "Are you sure? The consequences?" "I'm sure," Lorenzo replied, his eyes finding Isabella's across the crowded hallway. "Some things are worth any consequence." Antonio Jr. made one final attempt to salvage the situation, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone who had just realized his position was weaker than he had assumed. "Lorenzo, think about what you're doing. Your emotions are clouding your judgment. We can work through this misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Lorenzo said, his patience finally exhausted. "You threatened my child and insulted a woman who has been nothing but loyal to my family. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I want nothing to do with it. You have 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave my house." As Antonio Jr. stormed off to gather his possessions and plan his undoubtedly dramatic departure, the family was left to confront the new reality Lorenzo's decision had created. Sofia attached herself to Isabella's side with fierce determination, as if her small presence could somehow protect the woman who had protected her. "Isabella," Lorenzo said, his voice gentler now, but still carrying the weight of momentous decision. "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to answer honestly." Isabella nodded, though her heart was racing so fast she could barely hear her own thoughts over its rhythm. "I just destroyed a crucial alliance for you, for this family, for the principle that my daughters should be free to choose their own happiness," Lorenzo continued, stepping closer until they were standing in the intimate space they had maintained for weeks without acknowledging. "But I need to know that you feel the same way I do, that this isn't just gratitude or circumstance, but something real." Isabella looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability beneath the confidence, the man beneath the power, the father and lover beneath the crime boss who ruled half of New York. "Lorenzo," she said, her voice steady with the certainty that had been building for months, "I've been in love with you since the night you found me crying over a burned sauce and told me that even the best cooks have disasters. I've loved watching you with your daughters, loved seeing the man you are when you think nobody is looking. And yes, I love you enough to face whatever comes next." The confession hung between them like a bridge finally completed, spanning the gap between duty and desire, between the worlds they came from and the future they might build together. Lorenzo reached for her then, his hands framing her face with the reverence of someone touching a miracle. "Then marry me," he said, the words surprising him as much as they surprised her. Not because of alliances or arrangements or family obligation. "Marry me because I love you. Because you make me want to be a better man. Because I can't imagine my life without you in it." The proposal was witnessed by his daughters, offered in a hallway still echoing with the consequences of choosing love over politics, and it was the most beautiful and terrifying moment of Isabella's life. "Yes," she whispered, and felt her world reshape itself around that single word. The 3 months following Lorenzo's explosive rejection of the Marcelli alliance passed in a whirlwind of adjustments, revelations, and the complex process of rebuilding a life according to new principles. The immediate aftermath had been as dramatic as Isabella had feared. The Marcelli family's outrage, the ripple effects through the extended network of associates, the scramble to restructure business relationships that had depended on the failed marriage alliance. But Lorenzo navigated the crisis with the same strategic brilliance that had built his empire, turning what could have been catastrophic weakness into unexpected strength. He leveraged the moral authority of his position, a father protecting his child from an abusive marriage, to gain support from other families who had their own concerns about the Marcellis' growing aggressiveness. Within weeks, what had seemed like isolated defiance was being praised as principled leadership. Isabella found herself thrust into a role she had never imagined possible. The future wife of one of New York's most powerful men, responsible for bridging the gap between the world she came from and the one she was entering. The transformation required learning new skills beyond cooking, understanding the subtle protocols that governed social interactions among crime families, and finding ways to maintain her authentic self while adapting to circumstances that would have overwhelmed someone with less inner strength. "You realize," Maria said one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing for a dinner party that would introduce Isabella to the extended network of Lorenzo's associates. "You've completely revolutionized Papa's approach to everything. He's been different since that day with Antonio Jr., more decisive, more willing to trust his instincts." Isabella smiled as she arranged canapes with the artistic precision that had become her signature. "Your father was always those things. He just needed permission to let them show." The observation reflected her growing understanding of the man she was going to marry. someone who had spent years balancing competing demands until he had almost forgotten what his own desires looked like. The most profound change was in Sofia, who had blossomed under the security of knowing that her beloved Isabella was now a permanent part of the family. The 8-year-old had appointed herself as wedding planner, approaching the task with the same focused intensity her father brought to business negotiations. She had strong opinions about flowers. Roses are too ordinary. Music, it should be romantic but not boring. And the guest list, only people who are nice to Isabella. Lorenzo himself was navigating the transition with characteristic thoroughness, determined to ensure that Isabella's integration into his world would be as smooth as possible. He arranged for language tutoring to help her perfect her English, though she was already more fluent than many native speakers. He introduced her to trusted associates gradually, allowing relationships to develop naturally, rather than forcing acceptance through authority alone. The most significant challenge came from an unexpected source, Isabella's own family in Mexico. When news of her engagement reached Guadalajara, the response was a mixture of joy, concern, and profound confusion about how their daughter had managed to capture the heart of a man whose wealth and power seemed like something from a telenovela. "Mija," her mother said during one of their weekly phone calls, "are you sure about this? These people, this life, it's so different from everything we know. What if you lose yourself in all that luxury and power?" Isabella understood her mother's concerns, had wrestled with the same fears herself during sleepless nights when the magnitude of her life's transformation felt overwhelming. "Mama, I haven't lost myself. I've found the person I was always meant to be. Lorenzo sees me, really sees me, and he loves what he sees. That's worth any adjustment." The conversation was overheard by Lorenzo, who had developed the habit of checking on Isabella during her calls home, concerned about the emotional toll of maintaining connections across such vast distances. That evening, he presented her with plane tickets to Mexico for her entire family, along with an invitation to spend 2 weeks at the Castellano compound, so they could see for themselves the life she was building. "I want them to know you're not just surviving in my world," Lorenzo explained, his arms wrapped around her as they stood on the terrace overlooking the lights of New York. "I want them to see that you're thriving, that you're loved and respected, and valued for exactly who you are." The visit from Isabella's family became a celebration that lasted 3 weeks, during which the Castellano mansion was filled with the sounds of Spanish conversation, Mexican music, and laughter that crossed all cultural boundaries. Lorenzo threw himself into the role of gracious host, with the same attention to detail he brought to business negotiations, arranging tours of the city, ensuring that Isabella's brother could visit several universities for his engineering studies, and spending hours in conversation with her father about construction techniques and the challenges of building in different climates. The most touching moment came when Isabella's grandmother, a tiny woman in her 80s who had traveled to New York for the first time in her life, took Lorenzo aside for a private conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours. Nobody knew what was discussed, but afterward, the elderly woman announced her approval of the match with the authority of someone whose opinion carried the weight of decades of wisdom. "He has good eyes," she told Isabella in Spanish, her weathered hands gentle on her granddaughter's face. "Eyes that see who you really are. And he looks at you like you're precious, not convenient. That's rarer than you might think, even in families where money isn't an issue." As the wedding date approached, Isabella found herself marveling at how completely her life had transformed, while somehow remaining fundamentally true to who she had always been. She was still the woman who found joy in creating beautiful food, who valued honesty over convenience, who believed that love was worth fighting for. But now, she was also someone who commanded respect in her own right, whose opinions were sought and valued, whose happiness was protected with the same fierce determination Lorenzo brought to protecting his family's interests. The night before their wedding, as Isabella stood in the kitchen that had been the first domain where she had felt truly secure, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow she would marry a man who had literally reshaped his entire world to make room for their love. And together they would build something that honored both the traditions that had shaped them and the dreams that called them forward. "No regrets?" Lorenzo asked, appearing in the doorway with the quiet grace that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "None," Isabella replied, moving into his arms with the certainty that came from finally understanding what home felt like. "Only gratitude for everything that brought us to this moment." 2 years after their wedding, Isabella Castellano stood in the kitchen of their renovated home, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, as she prepared dinner for a gathering that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The guest list included her brother Miguel, now graduated with his engineering degree and working for a construction company with ties to legitimate Castellano business interests. Maria and her new husband, a literature professor she had met at Columbia who treated her like an intellectual equal rather than a trophy. And Sofia, now 10 years old and fluent in 3 languages, thanks to her stepmother's patient tutoring. The transformation of the Castellano Empire under Lorenzo's new leadership philosophy had been gradual but profound. The focus had shifted toward legitimate business ventures, construction, restaurants, real estate development, while maintaining the old connections that ensured respect and protection. Isabella had played a crucial role in this transition, her natural diplomatic skills and genuine warmth helping to smooth relationships with business partners who might have been suspicious of sudden changes in established patterns. "The city inspector is coming Tuesday," Lorenzo announced as he entered the kitchen, loosening his tie with the satisfaction of someone who had just concluded a successful day of honest business. The restaurant renovation should be approved by the end of the week. The restaurant was Isabella's dream project, a high-end establishment in Little Italy that would showcase both traditional Italian cuisine and the Mexican flavors that had shaped her culinary imagination. It was being funded entirely through legitimate channels, a symbol of how far they had all traveled from the world of shadowy alliances and unspoken threats. "Miguel called," Isabella reported, turning to greet her husband with a smile that still had the power to stop his breath. "The foundation inspection passed perfectly. The community center should be ready for its grand opening next month." The community center was Lorenzo's contribution to the neighborhood where Isabella had grown up in Mexico. A facility that would provide educational opportunities, job training, and cultural programs for families struggling with the same challenges Isabella's family had faced. It was staffed by teachers from both Mexico and the United States, bridging cultures in ways that honored both traditions while creating new possibilities. Sofia burst into the kitchen with the dramatic energy of someone who had important news to share. "Isabella, guess what happened at school today?" Without waiting for a response, she continued, "Mrs. Peterson asked us to write about our heroes, and I wrote about you, about how you came to America and worked really hard and made our family better, and now you help other people too." Isabella knelt down to Sofia's level, her heart swelling with the kind of pride that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with watching the people she loved flourish. "That's very sweet, my amor. But you know the real heroes are your papa, who learned to choose love over tradition, and your sister, who had the courage to demand a marriage based on respect instead of arrangement. And you," Sofia insisted with the stubborn certainty that characterized all the Castellano women, who were brave enough to stay when it would have been easier to leave, and smart enough to help Papa become the man he really wanted to be. The assessment was delivered with 10-year-old directness, but it captured something profound about the journey they had all taken together. Lorenzo had indeed become the man he wanted to be, still powerful, still respected, but now guided by principles that prioritized human dignity over political convenience. That evening, as their extended family gathered around the dining room table that had once hosted negotiations between crime families and now welcomed professors, engineers, and community activists, Isabella reflected on the miracle of transformation that love could accomplish when it was supported by courage and determination. "I want to make a toast," Lorenzo said, rising from his chair with the natural authority that would always be part of who he was. "To family, in all its forms. To the family we're born into, the family we choose, and the family we create when we're brave enough to follow our hearts instead of our fears." He looked directly at Isabella as he spoke, his eyes reflecting the same wonder that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Amazement that something so beautiful had emerged from circumstances that could have destroyed them both. "To Isabella," he continued, "who taught me that the strongest foundation for any empire is love, and that the most valuable inheritance we can leave our children is the example of choosing happiness over obligation." The toast was echoed around the table in multiple languages, a sound that perfectly captured the multicultural, multi-generational family they had built together. As conversation flowed between Spanish, Italian, and English, as Sofia practiced her French with Maria's husband, as Miguel discussed engineering principles with Lorenzo's business associates, Isabella understood that they had accomplished something remarkable. They had taken the best of their traditions, the Italian emphasis on family loyalty, the Mexican celebration of community, the American belief in reinvention, and combined them into something entirely new. The Castellano family of today honored their past while refusing to be imprisoned by it, maintained their strength while rejecting the cruelty that had once seemed inseparable from power. Later that night, as Isabella and Lorenzo stood together on their bedroom balcony overlooking the city that had become their shared kingdom, she thought about the young woman who had arrived in this house 3 years earlier with nothing but culinary skills and stubborn determination to survive. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Antonio Jr. hadn't been such an arrogant fool?" Lorenzo asked, his arms wrapped around her from behind as they watched the lights of New York twinkle in the distance. "I think we would have found each other anyway," Isabella replied, leaning back against his chest with complete trust. "Some connections are too strong to be denied forever. We just might have taken a longer, more complicated path." The answer satisfied them both, confirming what they had always suspected, that their love was not an accident of circumstance but something that had been waiting to be discovered, something that would have survived any obstacle their worlds could have created. As they prepared for bed, Isabella checked her phone to find a message from her production team, the YouTube channel that documented their family's transformation and the community projects they supported had just reached 1 million subscribers. The success meant more funding for their charitable work, more opportunities to show other families that love really could triumph over tradition when it was combined with courage and commitment. "We're going to need a bigger kitchen," Lorenzo observed, reading over her shoulder. "If the channel keeps growing like this, you'll be cooking for film crews every week." "I can think of worse problems to have," Isabella laughed, setting the phone aside to focus on the man who had risked everything to choose love over duty. "Besides, you know I do my best work when I'm cooking for people I care about." The conversation drifted into comfortable silence as they settled into the rhythm of married life. But both of them were thinking about the future they were still building together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that families could change without losing their essential strength, that traditions could evolve without being abandoned, that love really was powerful enough to transform the world when it was supported by courage, wisdom, and unshakable commitment to each other. In the kitchen below, Sofia's essay about heroes sat on the counter where she had left it, its closing lines perfectly capturing the truth that had guided their entire journey. Sometimes being a hero just means being brave enough to love people who are different from you, and smart enough to know that families are stronger when they include everyone who wants to belong. And in bedrooms throughout the house, in a renovated mansion that had become a true home, in a family that had redefined itself according to principles of love rather than obligation, everyone slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had created something beautiful, something lasting, something that proved that even the most entrenched traditions could be transformed by the revolutionary power of choosing happiness over fear. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of love conquering all obstacles. And hit that notification bell so you never miss an update on families who dared to rewrite their own destinies.